Hello and welcome back to Epiphanies by Lango. This is episode 2 with Bob. He doesn't need an introduction. Let's jump ahead on episode 2. Taking that in mind, I want to kick off the first question for you around this is what can companies do to minimize the when? Minimize the chances of when is what advice would you have for companies?
Well, you know what really is exacerbating the threats these days is the pandemic, because now we have a distributed workforce, which is fine with everyone working from home, and it's what we've got to do now to keep everybody safe. But that really provides more challenges for those corporations. 80% of all passwords, according to research, are not strong enough. So just doing some of the very basic things are critical for companies. There are several things that go into cybersecurity vulnerability. Artificial intelligence, the hackers are using artificial intelligence and machine learning. There's a whole series of things that make companies vulnerable, but maybe the biggest thing, and it's because it's the least predictable thing, is the human element. And that is when employees or people that are working for that public agency or private firm do something that invites that hacker in. For example, we know, according to research, that 5% of any employee population will always click on an email link. It's too tempting, or they make it look too appealing. And with artificial intelligence, the hackers can make it look very genuine. And so training of the employee population is really key these days. I think also partnering with a good IT provider that takes this cybersecurity serious and build security in from the ground up, because you can buy products and services that simply bolt on security as an after fact. If you're a really savvy company and you're looking out for your corporate security, your IT security, you partner with a firm and you buy the hardware and software from firms that really take security serious, and they build it in from the ground up. And then making sure that you've got the ability to rapidly detect a breach once it happens, because there's an hour or two, I call it the golden hour, that you've got to detect that hacker before that hacker goes laterally, that bad actor, and creates untold devastation by coming into your network and then getting into other networks or servers and getting other copies of backup copies of the data and deleting those. So you've got to be able to rapidly have the capability to detect those and then isolate them or recover to a good known state. So there really are a lot of things that corporations need to and can do to help prevent in this era of escalating cybersecurity threats.
Thank you for that, Bob. And when I was reading the SolarWinds case study, it seemed like the intruder was in the environment for many months, probably because they weren't able to detect. To your point, saying if you're able to detect early enough, and you said the golden hour, that's probably most crucial once the breach happens. What I found interesting, Bob, and I'd like you to elaborate that a little more, is I expected a Army veteran and a technologist to say, hey, you got to have AI, ML, you got to have this technology, you got to do whatever. While you said it, you placed a lot of emphasis on security policy. You placed a lot of emphasis on employees and users and behavior. Could you speak a little more of that piece, because most people don't focus on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. They leave that piece out. What some companies will do, and especially maybe small and medium businesses or mid-market businesses, is create what they believe is an impenetrable firewall, and that really is difficult to do these days. It's really tough to make it so that you cannot get through the firewall, because you do have employees that invite the hackers in unknowingly because they click on those links that look so tempting and appealing. So it's the training of those employees that really is critical and key. You've got to have a really holistic approach to it. And in some cases, a cybersecurity assessment is very helpful up front, where you look at things with social media and how the employees are using social media and what their email management is, and how we can filter out some of the suspicious emails there's a lot of things that can be done, but it's part of this overall security strategy that companies need to have. Employees and personnel working, are under a lot of pressure these days. Everyone has a lot of things that they have to do, a lot of things on their plate. And so when an email comes through that looks like it's from their chief financial officer, for example, and says, we need to release payment for this vendor, it looks very innocuous, and you would be tempted to click on that. And that is one way that the hackers get in quite easily. The passwords, employees typically are not required to change their passwords or have strong passwords, and that really needs to change too, because that's probably one of the biggest ways that bad actors can get in, is just by hacking in through a password or leaving IT equipment that's non-encrypted. Encryption is really key. I have talked to some small businesses that don't want to encrypt their data because they're afraid of how to manage the encryption keys, and if they'll lose those keys, maybe they lose access to the data. So what we're in is an environment these days where just operating an IT environment is not enough, or just managing a company is not enough. You've got to manage and train the employees. That's the most vulnerable asset, and frankly, the most important asset of any company is the human element there, and making sure that they're aware of and have some cybersecurity acumen that they might not normally have. Salespeople need to be trained. They're out there on the edge all the time. At the very moment, here's how it seems to be a perfect storm. At the very moment when we have an escalating cybersecurity threat with nation states getting involved, we also have this drive to go to the edge. And with all these edge devices, they're out there in vulnerable areas. And then on top of all of that, we've got the pandemic happening where everybody's working from their home. And so everyone's out and distributed on the edge. Now we have edge devices that are operating factories and healthcare centers and all that type of thing. And those all need to be very secure, although they're out there probably the most exposed. When we used to be in the environment where everything was safe and secure inside the data center, perhaps was a little bit easy to keep secure and to manage it. Now we need zero latency by getting all that quick access to data out there on the edge. And to do that, we've got to make sure the paramount concern is making sure all of that information and data is very secure. So it does take a new approach, and it takes a cognizant effort to watch what's happening not only in the environment, but also doing and adjusting to the new threats and trends, but also doing some of the very common things that need to be done and should be done, should have been done over the many years in the past. For example, updating your firmware and updating software. There are updates all the time to firmware, and keeping it updated is the right thing to do. You mentioned how hackers can get in and rummage around inside the IT infrastructure and not be recognized. That's because there haven't in the past been a lot of ways to monitor the firmware in a typical IT data center server, for example, and there are some over 4 million lines of firmware code that are operating that server. But that's before even the operating system or any of the other software applications take over and start to run. So if a hacker can get into that firmware code, they can potentially stay there for a long period of time, because there's not typically a scan tool or an antivirus tool that you would think of that operates and watches what's going on inside the firmware. So that is an area for what I call a Trojan horse opportunity, where a hacker can come in, get invited and get into the firmware, and then stay there for a long period of time, and then break forth in 30 or 90 days and open all the passwords or something like that. So it's a very scary environment, and people that are not part of a security team or not operating in what we call a SOC or Security Operations Center don't always see this. It might be actually quite frightening, as if most employees of a company saw what kind of threats and vulnerabilities and attacks that they're having on a regular basis.
Thank you, Bob. Much appreciate your time. And your wisdom that you've shared. I'm sure I walk away feeling a little more erudite than I was when I walked in. I hope our listeners and watchers do that too. And I'll encourage our listeners to reach out to you if they want to just talk to you about security at their workplace. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in as always. Appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the session with Bob, and you will create a much better workplace for all of us. Thank you, and bye-bye.